Voiceover. For decades, the world believed André Rieu was untouchable, the king of the waltz, a man with a private castle, a golden violin, and a smile that never faded. But that fairy tale was a lie. There is a reason why a man worth millions once collapsed backstage, unable to lift his head without the entire room spinning violently. Voiceover, buried in financial reports and whispered backstage accounts, is a terrifying truth. At the height of his fame, his company was carrying over 34 million euros in debt, and those closest to him have finally admitted the reality. He was living a double life for 30 years. Voiceover. If you think this is just a story about burnout, you're wrong. This is a story about a man who built an empire on a gamble so dangerous that a single dizzy spell threatened to bankrupt him and leave 120 families on the street. Voiceover. How did the man who made the world dance nearly lose the ability to stand? This is the untold story of the cost of joy. For 30 years, millions of fans were sold a perfect illusion. They saw the windswept curls, the charismatic conductor, the waltz king, who lifted his violin like a beacon of hope above crowds of 50,000 people. He seemed to be a creature made entirely of light. Light in his music, light in his eyes, light in the very air surrounding his orchestra. But according to the few people allowed inside his inner circle, that glowing stage persona was a mask. And behind that mask was a reality so heavy, it nearly crushed him. The world saw castles built as stage backdrops. They saw orchestras dressed in crinolines and tuxedos. They saw audiences rising in perfect synchrony as the Blue Danube began to play. They assumed happiness. They assumed effortless wealth. But behind the curtain, André Rieu was balancing on a razor's edge. He was living a double life. One life was built on beauty and romance. The other was built on a silent, grinding pressure that few could imagine. These two lives existed side by side, invisible to each other until the moment they collided hard enough to shake his entire empire. The first crack in the facade didn't appear on stage. It happened inside his own body. There are accounts of a night when he walked off stage and the world simply tilted. He couldn't lift his head. The ceiling spun. The floor swayed like the deck of a ship in a storm. His crew thought it was exhaustion. André thought so too. He told himself to push through until it happened again and again. That small, quiet moment of dizziness was the beginning of a nightmare the public wouldn't hear about for years. But the physical toll was only half of the hidden narrative. The other half was financial. Unlike government-funded orchestras, André Rieu had no safety net, no subsidies, no record label to bail him out. He had himself, his bow, and a business model that was terrifyingly fragile. Reports suggest that the pressure chamber he lived in was so intense that a single canceled tour could erase millions of dollars. Every firework, every gown, every truck in his massive convoy came with a price tag that would make pop stars hesitate. He was betting everything, every single night, on the hope that his body would hold out long enough to keep the machine alive. If the audience had known that a single dizzy spell could jeopardize the salaries of more than 100 musicians and crew members, would they have danced as freely as they did? Or would they have noticed how carefully he breathed between pieces? The truth is, André spent decades balancing the glittering world he built for the crowd against the trembling world he kept hidden even from friends. Whispers of severe illness, staggering debt, and a marriage pushed to its absolute limit, all of them were suppressed. So we aren't here to ask how he became famous. We are here to answer a much harder question. How did a man who spent his life creating magic for others survive the reality of living without it? To understand why André Rieu pushed himself to the breaking point, we have to go back to the beginning. Before the castles and the waltzes, he was just a quiet boy, growing up in a house in Maastricht where music filled every corner, but warmth did not. Interviews and biographies paint a picture of a childhood that was the exact opposite of his concerts. It wasn't romantic, it was cold. It was a home where precision mattered more than affection, and where displaying emotion was treated like a character flaw. His father was a conductor for the Limburg Symphony Orchestra. He was a man of the old school, strict, distant, and ruling with an iron baton. He believed in discipline above all else. And unfortunately for André, that professional rigidity followed his father through the front door every evening. In the Rieu household, wrong notes were met with stern silence. Laughter was often met with disapproval. Even simple curiosity had boundaries. When young André asked questions, he wasn't given answers. He was given sharp glances that told him to be quiet. His mother, according to reports, was no softer. She valued structure and the appearance of perfection. Together, his parents created an environment where the violin was revered more than the child holding it. The music never stopped, but neither did the pressure. André has openly stated, "My parents did not love me." He doesn't say this out of bitterness or anger. He says it as a cold statement of fact. It was the climate he grew up in. Every time he reached for his violin, he felt a confusing mix of attraction and terror. The instrument was his escape, but it was also his cage. He practiced scales until his fingers ached, desperate for a nod of approval from his father, a nod that rarely came. When he smiled, it was dismissed as frivolous. When he tried to put passion into his playing, it was seen as a lack of discipline. He learned very early that emotion had no place in the serious world of classical music. But here lies the paradox. Inside that frozen environment, a seed of rebellion was planted. It wasn't a loud, angry rebellion. It was a quiet imagination. While sitting in the back of empty theaters, watching his father command musicians like pieces on a chessboard, André began to dream of a different world. A world where music didn't suffocate people. A world where audiences weren't afraid to breathe, to laugh, or unthinkably to dance. For a child who rarely felt seen, this dream became a lifeline. It raises a profound question. How does a boy raised in total silence become the world's apostle of joy? Perhaps it's because joy was the one thing he was never allowed to touch. By the time he was a young man, the contrast between the cold world he inhabited and the warm world he wanted to build had become unbearable. But before he could shatter the mold of classical music, he had to survive the emotional mold of his own family. He didn't become the waltz king because his life was magical. He became the waltz king because he knew exactly what it felt like to live without magic. By his 20s, André had checked every box. He studied at conservatories. He mastered the technique. He joined professional orchestras. On paper, he was the perfect classical musician, following the roadmap his parents had drawn for him since birth. But inside, he was suffocating. On stage, he played flawlessly. But he looked out at the audience and saw statues. People sat stiffly in the dark, terrified to clap at the wrong time, applauding only when the program said they could. The atmosphere was polite, controlled, and dead. Classical music had become a ritual of rules rather than a living art form. For André, it felt like a continuation of his childhood cage. He started asking a question that no serious musician dared to ask. Why aren't they dancing? Why? To the traditionalists, this was a ridiculous question. Dance belonged in ballrooms, not concert halls. Joy was a distraction. But for André, the waltz was the first piece of music that ever made him feel free. Watching an audience remain frozen while playing a waltz felt like a tragedy. This is where the double life began to take shape. On one side, he was a dutiful employee of the orchestra. On the other, he was a radical imagining something that could destroy his career. He dreamed of outdoor concerts bathed in golden light. He dreamed of musicians who smiled. He dreamed of people holding hands and spinning. But when he finally gathered the courage to talk about a new kind of orchestra that didn't fear entertainment, the reaction was brutal. Colleagues stepped away. The classical elite laughed. They called him commercial. They called him a clown. They warned other musicians not to join him, whispering that working with Rieu was dangerous to their dignity. They said he was cheapening the art. He was isolated. People whispered about him in hallways. No one in that closed world imagined that those whispers would one day be drowned out by the roar of stadiums filled with 60,000 fans. But André persisted. In the late 1980 seconds, he scraped together a small group of outcast musicians who, like him, wanted to feel alive while they played. They formed the Johann Strauss Orchestra. They didn't just play. They performed. They wore gowns. They joked. They looked the audience in the eye. The purists rolled their eyes. But then, André did the impossible. He made waltzes sell like pop music. However, in those early days, no one knew the cost. No one knew that this rebellion was fueled not by deep pockets, but by sheer desperation to prove a point. He wasn't trying to destroy classical music, as his critics claimed. He was trying to save its heart before it stopped beating entirely. When André Rieu stepped onto the global stage in the 1,990 seconds, the speed of his ascent was blinding. The dream that started at a kitchen table turned into a phenomenon. Audiences didn't just clap, they wept. They stood on their chairs. In Australia, he achieved the surreal feat of holding 8 of the top 10 best-selling DVD spots nationwide. He was outselling rock stars with a violin. His concerts stopped being concerts. They became events. Ancient plazas were transformed into waltzing arenas. Castles were erected as stage sets. Fireworks erupted behind orchestras dressed in gemstone colors. Even the most stoic crew members found themselves caught up in the emotion of it all. The world crowned him the Waltz King, but that crown came with a crushing weight. Behind every standing ovation was a financial risk so enormous, it's hard to comprehend. Unlike the orchestras he grew up in, which were cushioned by government grants, André's empire was self-funded. Every gown, every flight, every hotel room for hundreds of staff, every piece of the stage, it all came out of his pocket. Every show was a gamble worth millions. A single missed flight, a thunderstorm, a sudden illness. Any of these could ripple into financial disaster. The grandeur the fans adored was backed by massive bank loans and relentless belief. Yet André kept building. He kept expanding. He kept dreaming bigger. By the early 2000s, he was no longer just a violinist. He was the CEO of a touring machine that crossed continents with military precision. He employed over 120 people. They were a family, yes, but a family that required constant momentum to eat. He bought a castle in Maastricht, a symbol of his success. But reports suggest even that castle rested on debt he willingly took on because the dream demanded it. Everything worked perfectly, as long as André stayed healthy, as long as he kept smiling, as long as he kept lifting that violin as if the world weighed nothing. But the world did weigh something. And the human body has limits, even for a legend. The rise of the Waltz King was breathtaking to watch. But the fall, unseen, unexpected, and undeniable, was already waiting in the wings. Sold-out arenas. But inside the operation, the cracks were widening. André was pushing his body through jet lag, altitude changes, and extreme stress with the determination of a man who was terrified to stop. Then, the collapse came. It didn't happen in front of the cameras. It happened in the quiet of his own home. According to accounts, André woke in the middle of the night to a world that had turned violent. The ceiling was spinning. The floor pitched beneath him. He tried to stand and couldn't. He couldn't walk. He couldn't even hold his violin. The diagnosis shook the foundation of his company. A severe vestibular disorder. A viral infection in the inner ear that destroyed his balance. For most people, this means a few weeks of bed rest. For André Rieu, it was a catastrophe. Imagine a man whose entire livelihood depends on standing under hot lights, moving with the music, and traveling constantly. Now, imagine that moving his head a few inches sends him into nausea and vertigo. The cancellations began immediately. Stadiums that were already built had to be torn down. Tickets had to be refunded. Marketing campaigns were pulled. According to financial statements discussed later in interviews, the financial bleeding was horrific. Millions of euros evaporated overnight. But the expenses didn't stop. Salaries still had to be paid. Equipment leases, venue contracts, insurance. The machine was burning cash, and the engine had stalled. Inside the Maastricht castle, where fans imagined a fairy tale life, there was only darkness. André lay in a dark room for days, unable to move. What frightened him wasn't the physical pain. It was the question whispering in the dark. What if I never stand on stage again? If his violin fell silent, more than 120 people would lose their livelihoods. An orchestra, a crew, an entire global operation depended on one man's inner ear. Reports from that period suggest the company was carrying tens of millions in debt. That number hung over his bed like a guillotine. Rehabilitation became his new full-time job. It wasn't glamorous. It involved standing on one leg, staring at a dot on the wall, and trying to force his brain to stop the world from spinning. It was slow. It was humbling. And there were moments he truly believed the dream was over. When he finally stepped back on stage months later, the audience cheered for his return. They saw a triumph. What they didn't see was the fear. The doctors had told him there was a chance of recurrence. For André, that felt like performing with a loaded gun pointed at his career. This wasn't just an illness. This was the moment the Waltz King looked into the abyss and nearly lost everything. There is a hero in this story who never takes a bow. Long before the world knew the name André Rieu, there was Marjorie. While fans know her as his wife, the people backstage know the deeper truth. Without Marjorie, the empire would have collapsed decades ago. They met when André was still a struggling musician, performing in nursing homes and community halls. Marjorie wasn't a performer. She was an academic, a writer, a woman who loved structure. But she saw something in the young, lonely violinist that no one else did. She saw the wound his childhood had left. She saw the massive dream he was too afraid to whisper, and she decided to bet her life on him. While André played, Marjorie built. She drafted the contracts. She designed the show concepts. She wrote the scripts for his onstage banter. She organized the early tours, often while pregnant, managing logistics from a kitchen table. People saw André smiling under the fireworks. Few realized that the fireworks only existed because Marjorie had spent sleepless nights calculating the budget to make them possible. She became the invisible CEO. She handled everything. André hated the legal battles, the negotiations, the scheduling. She created a bubble around him so he could focus entirely on the music. But when the collapse of 2010 hit, the weight on her shoulders became unbearable. Marjorie wasn't just caring for a sick husband. She was managing a financial crisis. Shows were canceling, banks were calling, staff needed reassurance, and the media was circling. Inside the castle, Marjorie made the hardest decision of their marriage. She ordered everything to stop. She didn't do it to save the business. She did it to save André. She realized that if the machine didn't stop, it would kill him. She took control of the doctors, the lawyers, and the creditors. She stood between André and the world, acting as a human shield so he could recover in peace. But trauma takes a toll. As André entered his 70s, Marjorie was aging too. The decades of stress, the constant travel, the weight of holding up the sky for her husband began to show. Her health weakened, her energy faded. Quietly, without a press release, she began to step back. She didn't stop believing in him. She simply could no longer carry the physical weight of a global tour. Her withdrawal was soft and dignified, but heartbreaking. André lost his co-pilot. He lost the person who had been in the wings for every single show for 40 years. This wasn't a scandal or a divorce. It was simply time, catching up with the woman who had kept the Waltz King standing. As André crossed into his 70s, he faced a new enemy. It wasn't debt, and it wasn't vertigo. It was the internet. Rumors began to spread with viral speed. Clickbait channels and fake news sites realized that tragedy sells. Headlines appeared: André Rieu, gravely ill. Family in mourning. The Waltz King has passed away. These weren't just whispers. They were entire videos gaining millions of views. For a man who had dedicated his life to bringing joy, watching strangers monetize his supposed death was a surreal cruelty. Fans panicked. Venues received calls asking if tickets were still valid. It got so bad that his son Pierre had to appear on camera and say something no son should ever have to say: "My father is still here. Please don't kill him off just for views." This exposes the dark side of digital fame. To the internet, André had become a symbol, not a man. Symbols aren't supposed to age. They aren't supposed to get tired. So when fans saw him looking weary during a performance or noticed Marjorie wasn't there, they didn't ask if he was okay, they assumed the worst. But André's response to this digital toxicity was perfect. He didn't get angry. He didn't sue. He simply let the music speak. He started appearing in small, candid videos on social media, clips of him feeding his dog, walking in his garden, smiling at his orchestra members. He didn't say a word about the rumors. He just showed the world he was alive. There was a quiet defiance in it. The more the internet tried to bury him, the more alive he appeared on stage. However, the rumors did leave a mark. They forced everyone to look at the reality. He is getting older. His steps are slower. His curls are silver. When he smiles now, it's a softer smile, one that carries the weight of survival. When he looks out at the crowds in Maastricht now, he knows something he can't say aloud. They aren't just cheering for the music anymore. They are cheering for the man who survived being erased. By 2024, it seemed André had beaten the odds. He was back. He was touring. He seemed invincible again. But the body has a memory, and it holds grudges. The warning he had spent years ignoring finally caught up with him in Mexico City. The schedule was brutal. 6 nights in a row, high altitude over 2,000 meters, major jet lag, and a flu virus ripping through the crew. Even the young musicians were struggling to breathe. But André, with his old-school discipline, refused to cancel. He walked on stage. Night 1, he performed through exhaustion. Night 2, his hands were trembling. He came off stage pale, sweating, and coughing. His team looked at him with terror. Yet, he insisted on preparing for night 3. He didn't make it. His fever spiked. His voice failed. In a rare moment of total vulnerability, André called Marjorie from his hotel room. He whispered words she hadn't heard in decades. "I don't ever want to start a tour like this again." Those words hit harder than the collapse in 2010. They were an admission of fear. He finally realized that his willpower could no longer override his biology. The remaining concerts were canceled. 40,000 tickets refunded. The financial hit was significant, but the emotional shift was permanent. This wasn't just a bad week. It was an ultimatum from his own body. Slow down, or I will stop you forever. And for the first time, André listened. In the aftermath, his son Pierre stepped into a new role. He became the protector. He reorganized the entire touring structure. No more insane flight schedules. No more consecutive marathon runs. He built buffers into the calendar. Backstage, a new checklist appeared. Hydrate. Rest. Limit the encores. Protect energy at all costs. The audience didn't notice the change. They still saw the smile and the show. But behind the curtain, there was now a safety net. Mexico City wasn't a failure. It was a second chance. The Waltz King learned that he could still dance, but only if he learned to follow the rhythm of his own heart. After Mexico City, a subtle change washed over André Rieu. The tension that had defined his career, the desperate need to prove himself, to earn the love he was denied as a child, seemed to loosen. He entered a new era. A gentler era. The tours became smaller and more intentional. He focused on the cities he loved: Vienna, Maastricht, London. Rest days became sacred. The frantic race against time was over. Even the music shifted. Orchestra members noted that the set list began to breathe. Fewer high-speed polkas, more emotional, slower waltzes. He gave more spotlight to his musicians, allowing himself moments to stand back, lower his violin, and just smile at the family he had built. It wasn't a weakening of his power. It was an evolution. He transformed from the conqueror into the elder statesman. At 75, standing on the Vretov Square, the connection with the crowd is different now. It's deeper. When he plays, people aren't just entertained. They are moved by his endurance. His home life changed too. Marjorie now watches from the castle, saving her strength. Their mornings are quiet: coffee, dogs, grandchildren. He practices his violin daily, not for perfection, but for peace. There is a touching image of him walking slowly through his garden, a man who conquered the world, now finding happiness in a single flower. He plays quiet notes in his study, playing for the little boy who once learned to dream in silence. He is passing the torch too. Young soloists like Emma Koch are given the stage, bringing a new generation into the fold. The Johann Strauss Orchestra has aged with him. They are a family growing old together, survivors of the same wars. This new era isn't the fading of a legend, it is the refinement of one. A smaller world, perhaps, but a legacy that is finally secure. When we look back at the life of André Rieu, it's easy to focus on the numbers. The millions of albums, the billions of YouTube views, the massive stages. But the real story isn't about size. It's about a question he has carried since he was a lonely child in a cold house. Can joy be serious? For a boy raised under strict discipline, the idea that music existed to make people happy was a radical rebellion. For the man who built an empire on it, it became a crusade. But we now know the cost. We know about the vertigo, the debt, the fear in the dark, the sacrifices of his wife, the sheer physical toll of carrying the happiness of millions on his shoulders. André Rieu didn't just perform for the world. At times, he had to carry it. The miracle of his story is that he never let the darkness win. He recovered from illnesses that should have retired him. He rebuilt fortunes that were lost. He faced the mockery of the elite and the cruelty of the internet, and his response was always the same. Play the music. Maybe that is why, even now, when he lifts his baton, people cry. They aren't just reacting to a song. They are feeling the resilience of the human spirit. They are feeling the boy who wanted warmth, and the man who decided to create it himself since no one gave it to him. Across continents, strangers hold hands at his concerts. Families reunite. The cynical world melts away for 3 hours. This is the power he unlocked, not through complexity, but through compassion. A life spent making the world dance is not a simple life. It is a life of immense weight. But as he stands in this final, golden chapter of his career, the answer to his question is clear. Yes, joy is serious. Happiness is an art form. When the violin finally rests, his legacy won't just be the music, it will be the permission he gave us. He took a rigid, frozen world and melted it. He reminded us that we are allowed to feel. We are allowed to cry. And most importantly, we are allowed to dance.